Hello and welcome to the March Research Information Volunteer Call, Improving Lives Part 2, Long-Term Complications and Psychosocial Health. Today's presenters are Jonathan Rosen, Ph.D., Associate Director of Research, and Jeannette Soderberg, Director of European Research.
Thanks for the introduction, Brian. We're both really excited to be here and tell you about the exciting work happening in our Improving Lives program. People may know that JDRF has several scientific areas, which you hear about on all of the RIV calls. The Improving Lives program is the one dedicated to developing products for people who are currently living with established type 1 diabetes. The vision of the Improving Lives program is a world where people with type 1 live healthy and burden-free lives. The way we're going to get there is by supporting the development of drugs, devices, and behavioral health interventions to improve outcomes in people with type 1. There are major unmet clinical needs remaining for people with type 1 diabetes. We know that blood glucose control is a challenge for many. Metabolic control, things like obesity and ketones and insulin resistance, are largely unaddressed by current therapies. And unfortunately, long-term complications remain a reality for many. There are also unmet needs when it comes to mental health and quality of life, which are just as important as clinical needs. We know that people with type 1 are disproportionately affected by mental health issues, which in turn affect hard clinical outcomes like A1C. And my colleague, Dr. Soderberg, will tell you more about this later. Additionally, the burden of living with the disease, the insulin dosing and the carb counting and the device management and everything else imposes a toll on all people with type 1. The upshot is that we've come a long way in improving the lives of people with type 1 with new technology, but we have further to go. And our program is working to improve health and happiness for people with type 1. The Improving Lives program is divided into 4 parts. On the previous RIV, I talked about improved AP systems and devices, as well as drugs for drugs for glucose and metabolic control, including insulins and non-insulin drugs. Today, we're talking about therapies for long-term complications and to address the psychosocial burden of the disease. Let's take stock of where we are in terms of therapies available for people with type 1. When it comes to eye disease, we have a class of drugs called VEGF inhibitors, including Lucentis and Eylea, which are very good. We unfortunately have no targeted therapies for type 1 diabetes, kidney, or heart long-term complications. And we have some psychosocial interventions that are sort of out there, but we need more and we need them validated to really make a big dent in mental health outcomes for people with type 1 diabetes. In the future, we're building toward a world where there are therapies that can prevent, delay, or even reverse diabetic complications of the eye, kidney, and heart, and diabetes-focused behavioral health interventions that are available to improve the mental health of people with type 1 diabetes. Now I'm going to tell you about our work in long-term complications. So for the last several years, our main focus in complications has been the eye and the kidney. Diabetic retinopathy, which is a complication of the eye, is a very kind of serious and feared complication because it can cause vision loss. The estimate is that globally, the rate of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, which is the stage of disease that can risk vision loss in people who've had type 1 for more than 20 years, is 40%. But I want to remind people this doesn't mean that for any particular person, the risk is 40%, because this figure comes from a global analysis with many different populations that have different therapies available, et cetera. What we always say is that the best way to avoid retinopathy in the future right now is to practice ABC, that's A1C, blood pressure, and cholesterol, and that'll go a long way. We have approved therapies, which are great. But these therapies do have limitations, which is why we're still in the space working for more and new therapies. And I'll tell you about that later. On the kidney side of the equation, the situation isn't as advanced. Right now, there are no drugs available for type 1 diabetes kidney disease. And it's estimated that more than half of people in their lives will be affected by diabetic nephropathy. So there's an urgent need to develop therapies here for type 1, which I'll be telling you about. The JDRF complications strategy has several facets to it. One is that we don't know enough about T1D specific pathophysiology especially of the kidney. And so we support studies to understand the basic science better. We also, of course, need to get people with type 1 diabetes into clinical trials to test new emerging therapies. And this includes resourcing the inclusion of people with type 1 into trials that are dominated by people with type 2 and kidney and eye disease, or even setting up T1D exclusive clinical trials. We also support preclinical development of new therapies, and we provide resources for the community. An example of this is we've supported work to develop biomarkers for retinopathy and nephropathy, which are now available to anyone who wants to use them to explore disease progression, drug efficacy, and other applications. Finally, we rely on significantly leveraged partnerships. What this means is when JDRF finds a partner we can work together with on a research project where JDRF puts in resources, the partner puts in resources, and together we can accomplish something that neither of us could have done by ourselves. Leveraged partnerships are especially important in the field of complications. This diagram is showing the progression of kidney disease, and the details aren't important here, but what matters is kidney disease, like all other long-term complications, take a long time to develop. Of course, this is very good for people with type 1 diabetes, that it takes a long time rather than happening overnight. But it causes a challenge for therapy development because it means that clinical trials have to be longer and bigger and more resource intensive to determine if a therapy is working. That's why pooling resources through leveraged partnerships is especially important in complications. And we are very lucky to have excellent partners in spades. I won't go through all of these, but the logos you're looking at include academics, governments, other funders, and public-private partnerships. Basically, if there's a partner anywhere in the world with a good project that we can use to advance research for type 1 diabetes complications, we'll find a way to work with them. Now I'm going to tell you about some of the really cool stuff happening in eye disease. And the first is what we call the Moonshot Initiative, where we're partnering with the Mary Tyler Moore and S. Robert Levine, MD Foundation. Mary Tyler Moore was not only a person with type 1 diabetes, but a very important and impactful person at JDRF. The Moonshot Initiative is starting by developing a new staging scale for diabetic retinopathy. The way retinopathy is assessed today is quite crude, relying on how many lines you can read in a chart, and also a little bit variable from place to place. So we want a uniform system that looks not just at how good your vision is on the day you're testing it, but many other sources of data about the eye and systemic factors to get a more nuanced and detailed picture of retinopathy development, which will also enable faster and more effective clinical trials for drugs designed to halt retinopathy in its tracks. This is the first step, but it's not the ultimate goal. The goal is to develop therapies that can not only prevent or delay vision loss, but actually reverse it. In other words, find a cure for eye disease, even when it's already quite far along. And this is where the Moonshot name comes from. Like our trip to the moon, many decades ago, it's something that sounded impossible until a group of motivated people got together with the right resources and were able to achieve it. And that's what we're looking forward to. Now I'll tell you about a great clinical trial that we're a supporter of. I mentioned before that VEGF inhibitors are an excellent therapy for diabetic retinopathy. Examples are Lucentis and Eylea, which research that JDRF previously funded paved the way for. One drawback, however, to VEGF inhibitors is that they're administered to eyes that have already developed fairly long along the diabetic retinopathy path. And so we and our colleagues asked the question, if VEGF inhibitors are instead used earlier in disease progression, can they prevent further progression in disease rather than waiting until the disease is sort of already there? And there's a couple potential benefits to this. One is that we can ultimately improve vision outcomes. We think we can prevent side effects from the injections because when it's used earlier, it'll be used less frequently. And just in general, the philosophy that I think almost any clinician would agree with is that it's better to prevent disease than to treat it. We now have a readout from this trial and we can get a sense of how it's working. What you see here is that people who receive the VEGF inhibitor aflibercept have a lower rate of progression to these more severe stages of diabetic eye disease. What this means is that the first part of the hypothesis is bearing out. What we don't know yet is whether this will translate to better vision outcomes. And there will be sort of follow-up analysis of the participants in the trial to see if it does, because of course, saving vision is the ultimate goal. And we'll know in the near future whether that's been achieved. Another trial we're supporting is with a drug called Fenofibrate. So I just mentioned that one drawback of the current VEGF therapies is that the administration of them starts fairly late in disease. Another drawback is that they're burdensome and invasive. They don't work for every single person, and they're also costly, so not everyone has access to them. This is one of the things that motivated us to test Fenofibrate, a generic, orally available, safe, cheap medicine available all over the world. And what this means is that if this pill can improve diabetic retinopathy outcomes, it can have a true global impact. There's supporting data for why we should test it. It's shown efficacy in 2 trials for retinopathy in type 2 diabetes. And this is why we're now supporting a definitive clinical trial testing it in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. This is part of a great collaboration with the DRCR network, as well as NIH, Rosen, and our colleagues at the Helmsley Charitable Trust. The trial's up and running. This is a big trial. They need approximately 900 participants, and there's already more than 30 sites participating. Now I'm going to change gears a little bit and tell you not about a specific drug we're looking at, but more sort of a concept to move the whole field forward. And that concept is outcomes beyond A1C. So we know today that A1C is associated with the risk of long-term complications, and that's why it's such a valuable metric, both for self-care and also for drug development. But what we don't know yet is how CGM metrics are associated with long-term complications. When I say CGM metrics, I'm talking about things like time in range, glycemic variability, time in hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia, and others. JDRF has been a huge advocate for incorporation of these metrics, and this was sort of codified in a paper we participated in that's cited here, the International Consensus on Use of Continuous Glucose Monitoring, to get everyone on the same page about how to use these metrics. There's no question that things like time in range, meaning how much time you spend between 70 and 180 mg per deciliter, and glycemic variability, which means how much your blood sugar goes up and down over a period. There's no question that those are so important for people's day-to-day lives, but less is known about whether they're associated with long-term complications the way A1C is. There's reason to think that they will be. What I'm showing here is a slide from a really seminal paper published by our colleague Roy Beck, where he looked at historic data from a trial done before there were CGMs, and they relied on 7-point finger prick samples. And what he found is that the more time participants spent in range between 70 and 180, the lower their chance of progressing to diabetic retinopathy. So this is very encouraging for the hypothesis that these outcomes beyond A1C are also predictive of long-term complications. We're currently funding work with Dr. Shah at the Barbara Davis Center to sort of build on these results and look at time in range from real CGM use in the real world, not a clinical trial setting, and see how it associates with retinopathy progression. This work and other projects like it are important for a couple of reasons. One is that we want people with type 1 and their care providers to understand the full clinical meaningfulness of CGM metrics to optimize their care. And the other reason is that it ties into our regulatory strategy. Today, the only way you can get a drug for glucose control approved is by demonstrating an A1C reduction. But A1C trials are long and they have other certain drawbacks. If we can demonstrate that CGM metrics like time in range and glycemic variability are also tied to long-term complications, we can potentially make those regulatory approvable endpoints and enable shorter, more economical trials and more drug development for type 1 diabetes. So I mentioned earlier that we don't know everything there is to know about the pathophysiology of kidney disease and type 1. And obviously this is important for developing new therapies. For this reason, we focus projects in a couple areas. We do T1D focus studies to understand physiology. We also work to include people with type 1 in trials being run by others, which are predominantly focused on type 2 diabetes. We're increasingly doing really great molecular analysis using cutting edge techniques to understand what's happening in the kidney of people with type 1. We're partnering with a couple consortia called Trident and KPMP, an investigator named Dr. Bjornstedt in Colorado, and others to use cutting edge tools, especially with kidney biopsies from people with type 1, to understand what's happening at the most microscopic, detailed level so that we can develop more targets, better understanding of the disease, and ultimately better therapies. But the good news is, even though we don't know everything there's to know about kidney physiology and type 1 diabetes, the experts agree it's pretty similar to what's happening in type 2 diabetes, which means that as we look for the first drug available for kidney disease in type 1, the drugs available for kidney disease in type 2 are sort of low-hanging fruit. And we're doing everything we can to get drugs that work in type 2 kidney disease into type 1. Here I'm highlighting two types of drugs that fit the bill. One is a class of drugs called SGLT inhibitors, and the other is a drug called finerenone. Both have demonstrated incredible efficacy and gotten approval for kidney disease in type 2 diabetes. I'm showing here graphs from the pivotal clinical trials. The details aren't important, but the point is these drugs improve kidney outcomes and indeed save lives in the trials. But people with type 1 diabetes were excluded from the trials, and people with type 1 diabetes are thus excluded from the regulatory labels and don't have ready access to these drugs that are transforming care for people with type 2 diabetes, and in some cases, even people without any kind of diabetes and kidney disease. And we're doing what we can to get these into type 1. That's sort of top priority. I'm going to tell you a bit more about our work in the SGLT class. So this is a class of drugs that I've talked about before because they were originally developed for glucose control. The mechanism is called glycosuria. What this means is that you pee out the extra sugar. In type 1 diabetes, several companies pursued this drug class for glucose control in type 1. But the barrier everyone ran into is that although they demonstrate strong glucose control benefits, they also increase the risk of DKA. As a result, none of these are approved in the US, although there was more success abroad. The interesting thing is that as these trials are being done in type 1 diabetes, more and more evidence is emerging from non-type 1 populations that these drugs don't just control glucose control, they also improve heart and kidney disease. And that's sort of the graphs I was showing you on the last page. As I said, people with type 1 weren't there. So as the benefits are accruing for the heart and kidney aspects of this drug in non-type 1 populations, people with type 1 aren't able to reach them. And this is why it's so important to advance SGLT inhibitors for heart and kidney disease in type 1. We have a threefold strategy here. The first is to improve DKA risk mitigation, since DKA risk is the critical barrier preventing people with type 1 from using these drugs and getting the heart and kidney benefits. And one way we're doing this is by developing continuous ketone monitoring technology, which is something I talked about in the last RIV. The second way we're doing it is by developing clinical trials for people with type 1 who have heart and kidney disease. As I said, many trials have been done with these drugs, but people with type 1 weren't included. And getting these drugs tested in people with type 1 is critical. And the third aspect of our strategy here is leadership. We are the ones bringing people together to solve this problem. We've had multiple workshops and roundtables, talk to key opinion leaders. We're bringing together academics, other stakeholders, even the FDA came to one of our workshops and provided valuable feedback. And we are working with the community to lead an effort to chart the road forward for these drugs in type 1, which have so much promise to save lives. As I said earlier, in recent years, we focused mostly on eye and kidney disease. Today, we're increasingly working on cardiovascular disease as well. Cardiovascular disease, here it's abbreviated CVD, is in fact the leading cause of mortality in adults with type 1, and it's closely associated with diabetic nephropathy. And so we're interested in developing therapies that can improve cardiovascular disease as well as those other complications. As an example, I'm showing you the headline from a request for applications that we published in the last year, clinical trials to advance therapies for nephropathy and cardiovascular disease and type 1 diabetes. We got some fantastic proposals from the community, which we're currently evaluating. And I promise you, there will be some very good T1D focused clinical trials coming out of this for heart and kidney disease. Two of the drug classes I mentioned before in the context of kidney disease, SGLT inhibitors and finerenone, as well as other drugs like GLP-1 receptor agonists, have tremendous promise to improve CVD outcomes in type 1 because that's what they do in other populations. Finally, I want to just make the point that although the drugs that have been developed for type 2 diabetes complications represent a great source of material for us to test in type 1, we're not relying on them exclusively. We're also feeding earlier stages of the product development pipeline to make new therapies that are going to work for kidney and heart and eye disease in type 1 diabetes. One example I want to focus on here, just as one cool example of the sort of research we're supporting, is on a new approach to inflammation. And we support an investigator named Catherine Godson, who's working on a drug class called lipoxins. And this is a new way to deal with inflammation. Instead of blocking it, it actually resolves it in the same way that a human body resolves inflammation when the threat is gone and it's no longer needed. The reason this is good is because it involves not only blocking inflammation, but also healing the tissue that was affected by the process. And so these sorts of therapies, this and others, are in preclinical development. And obviously the projects which are successful in the preclinical stages, like in vitro testing and animal testing, we'll do what we can to accelerate them toward clinical trials. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jeannette Soderberg.
It's great to be here today to talk about the psychosocial priority area. Diabetes, as you know, can be really tough sometimes. And while many people do incredibly well with diabetes, they thrive and live happy lives, sometimes people struggle. And this is something that can happen at all stages of life. Diabetes has been reported to be a risk factor for psychosocial issues such as distress, depression, and anxiety through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. And therefore, psychosocial well-being is one of JDRF's key priority. Feeling the psychosocial burden of diabetes is pretty common. Around 25% of adults are likely to experience depression during their lifetime. And more than that will actually experience diabetes distress at some point. And while, as John mentioned before, there are psychological interventions available, a lot of them have limitations such as lack of validation in large populations, unclear long-term effectiveness, and often reimbursement and access is an issue. For adults, it's one thing, but for children and adolescents, a recent study showed that diabetes-related stress happens in around 20% of youth and mild depression in 14%. And for teens, more than half reported a low level of motivation to manage their diabetes, which we often know leads to conflicts in the family. And the situation reduces the well-being of the whole family, not only the person with diabetes. So there's a great need for better psychological well-being, and that's why we have this program. Our strategy in this field focuses on four areas. One is to standardize outcomes measures. It's currently difficult to compare treatments and healthcare pathways due to the lack of standardized measures. We need these to be able to get an overview of the status today and provide a healthcare benchmark to improve care. The second is to increase the number of interventions that are available. We need to develop new diabetes-specific treatment options and give everyone with type 1 an intervention that they can try. We also need to increase the number of trained psychology professionals to ensure that trained professionals are available and can deliver the new interventions and support the community. And fourth, we need to work on improving access to healthcare so that people can access the support that is available and the new interventions we are developing. And I'll be talking today about some ways of doing that through telemedicine and e-health approaches. And I'll be walking through some of the projects in more detail. Good access to care is associated with better glycemic control and better outcomes for everyone with diabetes. A lot of people don't have access to healthcare in their daily life, and telehealth can be an enabler for people who otherwise would have had limited access to care. It can be super useful and efficient for people who are in remote rural areas, but also for those who are in the city but are not able to take time off work or are dependent on a family member to take them to their physician, or those who like childcare. There are a number of people who could benefit from telepsychology. And telepsychology can also help address the stigma of people who don't want to seek psychological services for the first time. And this might be a much lesser step to take than actually to have to go and see someone. And it can also improve retention rate and keep people going to the therapist. So we have 3 very exciting studies. I'll give you examples of what we have ongoing in this space. The first one is called REDUCE. It is a study looking at reducing diabetes distress in young adults using cognitive behavioral therapy. We know that young adulthood is an intense period in everyone's lives, with changes such as moving out of home, establishing relationships, going to university, starting a career, starting a family. And most young adults struggle, and people with diabetes struggle a little more than everyone else. We know that young adults are less likely to achieve their glycemic goals compared to other age groups, and they're also more likely to experience diabetes distress. Then we don't want people to go with untreated distress, because that can then develop into depression and anxiety in some cases. So to address distress before it gets worse, this trial is testing a cognitive behavioral therapy to see its effect on both distress and glycemic outcomes, with the hypothesis, of course, that those getting this therapy will have less distress and lower A1C. The treatment is a 10-week online treatment where glycemic controls will be monitored with CGMs. And the distress part will be monitored through an app on their phone. And they also have their weekly meetings with a psychologist over the phone. So everything is virtual here. The recruitment for this study is to start in May 2022, very soon. The study welcomes participants age 18 to 30 with diabetes distress. And if you're interested, you're more than welcome to email the address, which is at the bottom of this slide. The REACHOUT project is a very, very interesting project by Tricia Tang in Canada to try out a peer-to-peer support network in rural Canada. Due to the large distances in Canada, a lot of people with type 1 don't have access to a local community of peers. And the team has trained peer-to-peer supporters with different backgrounds of different ages to deliver support to other people with type 1, other adults. They have a profile in the app, which you can see on the slide here. And the participants in the study choose themselves their preferred peer supporter based on their profiles in a little video. The app offers a social network where you can have a personal chat with your peer supporter. You can have group chats with other members, and they have video huddles where they have small groups that discuss their interests, such as cooking or hiking or other things. So the idea here is to build a social network and have it easily accessible to folks. And JDRF is supporting the development of this platform and app, but more importantly, what we're studying here is, can this type of peer-to-peer support in an app lower diabetes distress and improve quality of life? And the study isn't recruiting anymore. It's in its analysis phase, and we're really hoping for the results to be positive when it comes. I wanted to speak a little about precision medicine, which is something I spoke about last year as well, but I think this is very topical and something that we need to bring up. Some people develop complications early, some people develop complications late, and some don't at all. And the same thing applies to psychological issues. Some people develop them early, some not at all, and some have recurrent issues coming back and back. And instead of treating everyone the same way, precision medicine is aiming at a treatment that is adapted to one individual or a group, a profile of individuals, and is much less a one-size-fits-all type of care. I'm bringing this up because we need different types of therapies, different types of interventions, because one and the same might not fit everyone. So we need a library of interventions that people can try to find the one that fits them the best. At the Center of Excellence at the Caswell Diabetes Institute at the University of Michigan, the team is working on this type of approach. So they are currently analyzing data from different sources: imaging data, omics data, genetics data, CGM data, psychological questionnaires, drug prescription data, and they're all mixing this up and using a really complex artificial intelligence analysis to create specific type 1 profiles. And these profiles then have different risk factors for different types of complications and probably respond differently to treatments. So by identifying these patterns and combining both clinical variables as well as psychosocial variables, the center is identifying personalized treatments in the future for these particular profiles, and that way personalizing medicine and making it tailored to people, which is cutting edge and super exciting. We have just discussed very high-tech AI profiling and cutting-edge science. We have also discussed telehealth and psychosocial interventions, but we also need to be mindful of what is called the digital divide. Some people don't actually have access to digital technology, and we have large groups of underserved populations in society that we need to support. Additional risk factors such as poverty or food insecurity or housing, people with these additional social risk factors experience mental health concerns and often lack adequate social support. And all of this, of course, can negatively impact self-management and result in poorer outcomes. And of course, these families are under a great deal of stress and struggling with multiple challenges at once, which prevents them from accessing healthcare. So to address this, Michael Harris, with the support from the Helmsley Charitable Trust, has developed a model to increase access to care by setting up specific centers for underprivileged populations. And he has shown significant lowering of A1C and the number of DKAs. What JDRF is supporting in this setting is important research to understand which risk factors have the most impact and which should we address first to get the best outcomes for people. So that is one part what we're trying to support a lot of, but the other side is also understanding barriers to access, both on the patient side, such as social factors that we just talked about, and stigma, but also the barriers on the healthcare professional side. For instance, what is hindering people from prescribing devices? What are the challenges healthcare professionals encounter? If we can help address that, we would also increase the access for people with diabetes. In addition to access to care, we need to see more people working in psychology, professionals that can support us and deliver the therapies that we have available. And we need to see more integration of behavioral health, such as psychological screening or therapies in routine diabetes care. And to help increase the number of trained psychology professionals that are skilled in diabetes, we are building a career pathway for psychologists who are interested in diabetes. It starts with the postdoctoral fellowship program to train new, young, promising researchers and scientists. And they are doing partly research and partly clinical work under the supervision of well-renowned mentors. And we have 4 new fellows this year. They're very talented people. We're really excited to have them on board. But we have also another step, which is career development awards available to attract qualified, promising people that are a little further in their career, so that we are building a pathway after the fellowship, so people have a way of establishing themselves in the field. The focus areas of these career development awards and fellowship programs have been really wide and covering a number of different topics. And this is intentional because in the long run, we want to strengthen all these areas where the fellows and the researchers can establish themselves and be experts in the field. So this is an opportunity that we hope will be growing the psychological field, and the people we have entered this far have been absolutely phenomenal. coming back to the point of access, we have ways of increasing the number of people working in this field, the number of psychologists. We have discussed ways of putting the individual with diabetes in focus and running promising clinical trials. But we are also working on strategies to increase access to psychological care and support, often limited by the factors of qualified professional, but also other things such as stigma. So to address this, we are supporting the development of interventions that can be delivered by many healthcare professionals. Nurses, for instance, is a fantastic professional group that can also deliver interventions. And there are many more nurses than there are diabetes psychologists. If we can develop interventions that can be delivered by the nurses, we would have increased access that way. We also want to include clinical and psychological outcome measures in all our studies to show strong benefits. The more scientific evidence we have, the more likely we are to spread the interventions and have them reimbursed. We're also including health economic studies to increase reimbursement. This way, by doing the health economic analysis, we have all the arguments we need to prove that psychological interventions are health economically beneficial and should be reimbursed. And the last piece are implementation studies to understand and overcome barriers. So that was a quick summary of the efforts that we had ongoing, and I hope it was helpful to give everyone a glimpse of the exciting work that we're doing. So just to summarize everything, improving lives of people with type 1 is a top priority for JDRF, and we are the world leader in this effort, I would say. The Improving Lives program is developing drugs and devices, as well as behavioral health interventions to improve outcomes and the quality of life for people with type 1 at all stages of disease and at all stages of people's lives. And we do this by strategically driving the field forward and ensuring that we have partners who also invest in this space. We cannot be alone, and we need to have others with us. So hopefully you will be hearing more from John and me during the year with results from the ongoing efforts that we have, and also about new exciting initiatives in the areas of complications and psychosocial work. So it has been a great opportunity to speak with you, and thank you so much. And we're really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.